Imagine waking up at 4 a.m. in a freezing stone room, knowing that if you mispronounce a single syllable of a dead language today, a grown man is going to beat you with a bundle of sticks. No smartphones, no weekends, and absolutely no recess. If you think modern high school is a nightmare, welcome to the world of medieval education. But here is the twist. Despite the brutal discipline and the lack of heating, the things medieval students learned, how they cheated on exams and what they did for fun, might actually sound shockingly familiar. Today, we are stripping away the textbook myths to look at what going to school in the Middle Ages was actually like. From the bizarre subjects they had to master to the riotous college subcultures that terrified local towns, you are about to discover how a system built on Latin and whips accidentally laid the groundwork for the modern world. Before we step into the classroom, we need to bust a massive myth. When you think of the Middle Ages, you probably picture a bunch of muddy peasants who couldn't read a clock, let alone a book. And while it is true that your average farmer wasn't curling up with literature at night, the medieval world wasn't a blank void of ignorance. After the fall of the Roman Empire, schools didn't just vanish, they shifted. For centuries, if you wanted an education, you had to join the church. Monasteries became the keepers of knowledge. Monks spent their lives copying ancient texts by hand under the flickering light of beeswax candles. But around the 11th century, Europe hit a turning point. Cities started growing, trade boomed, and suddenly kings and merchants needed people who could handle legal contracts, manage finances, and write diplomatic letters. The church schools couldn't keep up with the demand. Enter the cathedral schools. These were institutions run by local bishops in major cities, and they opened up education to people who didn't necessarily want to become monks or priests. If you were the son of a wealthy merchant or a minor nobleman, this was your ticket to a high-paying career. But getting through the door was only the first challenge. The real shock came on day one. Imagine walking into your first class, sitting down, and realizing that every single book, every lecture, and every conversation you are allowed to have is in a language you don't speak. That was the reality of medieval schooling. The universal language of education was Latin. It didn't matter if you were in England, France, or Germany. If you wanted to learn, you had to speak Latin. In fact, many schools banned students from speaking their native languages entirely, even during lunch. If you got caught speaking English or French, you were severely punished. Once you mastered basic Latin, you moved on to the core curriculum, which was divided into two distinct tiers. The first tier was called the Trivium, which translates to the three roads. It consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar wasn't just about punctuation, it was about mastering the mechanics of Latin. Rhetoric taught you how to write a persuasive speech or letter. But logic was the real heavyweight. Medieval educators were obsessed with logic. They didn't want you to just memorize facts. They wanted you to learn how to tear an argument apart, piece by piece. If you survived the Trivium, you earned the right to tackle the Quadrivium, or the Four Roads. This was the advanced stuff: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But don't picture modern math class. Arithmetic was mostly theoretical, focusing on the mystical properties of numbers. Geometry was used for architecture and land surveying. Music wasn't about learning to play the lute. It was the mathematical study of harmony and proportions. And astronomy was heavily intertwined with astrology, because understanding the alignment of the stars was considered essential for everything from planting crops to practicing medicine. So, what did a typical day look like? To put it bluntly, it was exhausting. The day started early, really early. Students were often up by 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. for the first lectures of the day. Because wax candles were expensive and window glass was a luxury, schools relied entirely on natural sunlight. You had to do your reading and writing while the sun was up. When you entered the classroom, you wouldn't find rows of neat desks. Instead, students usually sat on the floor, which was covered in straw to keep the damp cold from seeping through their robes. The teacher sat at the front on a raised wooden platform called a cathedra. Books were incredibly rare and obscenely expensive. A single textbook could cost as much as a modest house because every single page had to be made from parchment, which is specially treated animal skin, and written out by a professional scribe. Because students couldn't afford books, the teaching style was completely different from today. The teacher would read a passage from a master text aloud, and the students would write it down word for word on wax tablets using a sharp stylus. Once they memorized the passage, they would scrape the wax smooth and start over. There were no whiteboards, no handouts, and no Google. Your brain was your hard drive. If you drifted off to sleep during a 6-hour lecture on Latin grammar, the awakening was brutal. Discipline in medieval schools was unyielding. The primary tool of classroom management was the birch rod, a bundle of twiggy branches tied together. Teachers used it generously. Mistranslate a word, that's a lash. Arrive 5 minutes late because you were freezing, that's another lash. Historians have found letters from medieval kids writing home to their parents, begging to be taken out of school because the beatings were so severe. One famous scholar from the 12th century, Guibert of Nogent, wrote in his autobiography that his tutor used to beat him so hard for minor grammar mistakes that his skin turned black and blue, yet his mother still insisted he return to class the next day. But as the centuries rolled on, students began to find strength in numbers. By the late 12th century, a brand new institution emerged that completely shifted the power dynamic: the university. For all its flaws, brutality, and bizarre focus on dead languages, the medieval school system actually built the foundation of the modern intellectual world. The concept of a structured curriculum, the progression from a bachelor's degree to a master's degree, the idea of a campus community, and even the tradition of wearing caps and gowns at graduation, all come straight out of the Middle Ages. They taught the Western world how to argue, how to analyze texts, and how to think critically. Without the logical training of the medieval university, the scientific revolution of the Renaissance might never have happened. So, the next time you are sitting through a boring class or stressing over a heavy exam, just take a deep breath and remind yourself, at least nobody is trying to hit you with a bundle of sticks because you messed up your Latin verbs. What part of the medieval school day surprised you the most? Would you have survived the 4 a.m. lectures? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's strangest corners, and check out our video on what medieval medicine was actually like. See you next time.